What if the single biggest obstacle between you and the life you actually want has nothing to do with discipline, strategy, or effort? What if the obstacle is your obsession with being realistic? Jung stumbled onto something during his most dangerous psychological experiment, an experiment he conducted on himself, that turned everything the psychiatric community believed about ambition, desire, and achievement completely inside out. He discovered that the people who clung hardest to reality were the ones most trapped by it, and the ones willing to let go of what they could see, measure, and prove were the ones who ended up reshaping their lives in ways that looked, from the outside, like pure luck. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung actually found when he stopped trusting the obvious, how his framework reveals why being realistic is often the most self-destructive thing you can do, and what happens when you learn to work with the part of your mind that doesn't care about reality at all, because it's too busy building something better. This isn't manifestation culture. This isn't think positive and the universe delivers. What Jung found was far stranger, far more grounded, and far more uncomfortable than any of that, because it requires you to do something most people will never be willing to do. Abandon the map everyone else is following, and trust that you can navigate without one. In 1913, Jung did something that would have ended most careers. He was already one of the most respected psychiatrists in Europe. He'd been Freud's chosen successor, the golden boy of psychoanalysis, a man whose professional trajectory was about as guaranteed as trajectories get. And he walked away from all of it, the prestige, the safety, the certainty, to conduct an experiment that his colleagues would later call a nervous breakdown. He started listening to his unconscious mind, deliberately. He'd sit in his study, close his eyes, and let images rise. He didn't analyze them immediately. He didn't try to make them rational. He let them come, engaged with them on their terms, and recorded everything in what would eventually become the Red Book, a massive illustrated journal that reads like the diary of a man walking through his own psyche with a lantern and no map. His colleagues thought he'd lost it. His professional circle shrank. The realistic move would have been to stay the course, keep publishing papers, keep building the career that was already built. Instead, he chose to ignore every external signal telling him what was practical, safe, and smart. He dove inward. What came out of that period, which lasted years, was the foundation for nearly everything we now associate with Jungian psychology. Archetypes, the collective unconscious, individuation, shadow work, active imagination. All of it was born in a period where Carl Jung looked at consensus reality and said essentially, I think there's something more accurate underneath this. And here's what makes this relevant to you, right now. Jung didn't just develop a theory during that period. He developed a method, a way of engaging with parts of the mind that most people spend their entire lives ignoring. And what he discovered was that those ignored parts, the unconscious, the shadow, the archetypal patterns running beneath your daily decisions, aren't just interesting psychological concepts. They're the actual architects of your life. Let's start with what reality actually is, from a Jungian perspective. Most people treat reality like it's a fixed landscape. There are facts, there are circumstances, there are limitations. You assess the terrain, you make reasonable plans, and you execute. This is the approach every sensible person takes, and Jung would have agreed with it to a point. He was a scientist, after all. He valued observation and evidence. But he also noticed something that kept showing up in his patients, in his research, and eventually in himself. The people who were most devoted to being realistic were consistently the most stuck. They could describe their limitations with extraordinary precision. They knew exactly why they couldn't change careers, couldn't leave the relationship, couldn't pursue the thing that woke them up at 3 in the morning with a feeling they couldn't name. Their reasoning was airtight, their logic was flawless, and they were miserable. Meanwhile, the patients who made the most dramatic transformations, the ones whose lives genuinely changed, shared a common pattern. At some point, they'd made a decision that didn't make sense on paper. They'd followed an impulse that their rational mind couldn't justify. They'd taken a step that everyone around them called irresponsible, naive, or delusional. Jung would have called this alignment with the self. the deeper center of the personality that exists beneath the ego's endless calculations. The ego deals in probabilities, risk assessment, social comparison. The self deals in something else entirely. It deals in wholeness, in becoming what you actually are, regardless of whether that looks smart from the outside. And this is where most people get lost, because the self doesn't speak in the language your ego understands. It speaks in images, in dreams, in sudden urges that seem irrational, in that persistent feeling that something is wrong with your life, even though everything looks fine on the surface. It speaks in the gap between what you tell people you want and what you actually want, between the life you've built and the life that keeps haunting you. Think about someone who spent 15 years in a career that made perfect sense. They chose it for good reasons: stability, respect, a clear path. They're good at it. Their parents are proud. Their resume is impressive. And every single morning, something in their chest tightens when the alarm goes off. They've learned to call it stress. They've learned to manage it with exercise, meditation, weekends away. They've gotten so good at managing the tightness that they almost forget it's there. But it's there, every morning. 15 years of mornings. Jung would look at this person and see something very specific happening. He'd see an ego that has successfully constructed a life based on external criteria: safety, approval, predictability, while the self, the deeper core of who this person actually is, has been sending signals for 15 years that have been systematically overridden by realistic thinking. Every time that person thought about changing direction and then talked themselves out of it: I have a mortgage, I'm too old to start over, what would people think? They were choosing the ego's map over the self's compass. And Jung's entire body of work suggests that this choice, repeated enough times, doesn't just make you unhappy, it makes you sick, it makes you anxious, depressed, physically symptomatic. It creates the conditions for what he called a neurosis, which is really just the psyche's way of screaming when it's been ignored too long. So when we say ignore reality, we're really saying something more precise. We're saying ignore the ego's version of reality. Ignore the story your rational mind has constructed about what's possible, what's practical, what you deserve, and what the world will allow. Because that story, as convincing as it sounds, is almost always too small. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, and where Jung's work departs from anything resembling standard self-help. Jung discovered that the unconscious mind doesn't just passively store memories and feelings. It actively organizes your experience. It selects what you notice. It determines what opportunities you see and which ones you walk right past. It shapes your perception so thoroughly that two people can walk through the same day in the same city and have radically different experiences, because their unconscious patterns are filtering reality in completely different ways. He called this projection, and it's one of his most powerful and most misunderstood concepts. Projection isn't just about seeing your issues in other people, though it includes that. It's about the fact that your unconscious mind is constantly projecting a version of reality onto the world, and then you're responding to the projection as if it were the world itself. Think about what this means practically. If your unconscious is organized around the belief that you're fundamentally insufficient, a belief you probably picked up before you had words for it, then your entire perceptual system is tuned to confirm that. You'll notice criticism more than praise. You'll interpret ambiguity as rejection. You'll see closed doors more clearly than open ones. You'll call this being realistic about your limitations, and it will feel like honesty. It will feel like maturity, and it will be a prison. Jung recognized that this projection system operates whether you're aware of it or not. The question isn't whether your unconscious is shaping your reality. It is, always, right now, as you listen to this. The question is whether the patterns it's running are yours, chosen consciously, or inherited from wounds, family systems, and cultural conditioning that you never agreed to. This is why Jung emphasized making the unconscious conscious. His famous line, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate," is the most practical thing he ever said. It sounds philosophical. It's actually a blueprint for getting unstuck. So how do you actually do this? How do you ignore reality in the way that actually produces results, rather than in the way that produces delusion? Jung's method was precise, and it involved something he called active imagination. It's a practice that sounds simple and turns out to be one of the most demanding psychological exercises you can attempt. Here's how it works. You sit with whatever is bothering you, the stuck feeling, the anxiety, the inexplicable pull towards something you can't justify rationally. And instead of analyzing it, you let it present itself as an image. You give it space. You let the unconscious show you something. Maybe it's a figure, a landscape, a scenario. You don't control it. You don't judge it. You engage with it the way you'd engage with a real person in a real conversation. Jung did this for years. He'd encounter figures in his imagination, some terrifying, some wise, some contradictory, and he'd have actual dialogues with them. He'd ask questions and receive answers that his conscious mind hadn't generated. The answers often disturbed him. They challenged his assumptions. They pointed him in directions his ego would never have chosen. And those directions consistently turned out to be the right ones. What Jung was doing, and what this practice allows anyone to do, was accessing a source of intelligence that operates on completely different principles than the rational mind. The rational mind works by extrapolation. It looks at what has been and projects it forward. It's excellent for maintaining. It's terrible for transforming. Because transformation requires seeing possibilities that don't yet exist in your data set. The unconscious doesn't have this limitation. It works through patterns, symbols, and connections that the rational mind can't track. It sees the whole picture when the ego can only see the piece directly in front of it. And when you learn to access it deliberately, through active imagination, through dream work, through paying attention to the irrational urges you keep dismissing, you start operating with a form of intelligence that most people don't even know they have. If you've been sitting with that restless pull, the one that says something about your life needs to change even though you can't articulate what, then you're already hearing what Jung spent years learning to listen to. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises built around Jung's core teachings, designed to help you start that conversation with the parts of yourself that have been waiting for you to pay attention. The link is right below this video. Let me be clear about something though. This process doesn't look the way the title of this video suggests. You don't get everything you want instantly. What actually happens is both slower and more radical than that. What happens is that your definition of everything you want changes. Jung observed this pattern over and over. A patient would arrive wanting something specific, a better relationship, career success, relief from anxiety. And through the work of engaging with the unconscious, of integrating the shadow, of learning what their deeper self actually needed, the thing they wanted would shift. Sometimes it would expand beyond what they'd imagined. Sometimes it would simplify into something they'd never have thought to ask for. Sometimes they'd realize that the thing they wanted was a substitute for something much more fundamental that they'd given up on wanting years ago. Imagine you've spent a decade chasing career success because somewhere around age 11, you learned that accomplishment was the only reliable way to get your father's attention. That belief went underground. It stopped being a belief and started being reality, obvious, unquestioned, invisible. So you built a life around it. You optimized for achievement. You sacrificed relationships, rest, curiosity, play, all the things that didn't produce measurable results because the unconscious pattern said those things weren't safe. Only achievement was safe. And then, through whatever door you walked through, therapy, a crisis, a moment of silence that lasted long enough for the truth to surface, you make that pattern conscious. You see it. You see the 11-year-old. You see the father. You see the deal you made before you knew you were making it. And suddenly, everything you want isn't a corner office and a 6-figure bonus. Maybe it includes those things, or maybe it doesn't. But the wanting itself has changed. It's coming from you now, from the self, rather than from a wound disguised as ambition. And what you pursue from that place has a completely different quality to it. It fits. It doesn't require you to perform your way through every day. It aligns with something that your body recognizes even before your mind catches up. That alignment is what people on the outside call luck. It's what they call things just falling into place. And it looks instantaneous from the outside because they didn't see the internal work that preceded it. Jung wrote about synchronicity, the phenomenon of meaningful coincidences that can't be explained by cause and effect. He was careful about this. He knew it sounded mystical, and he spent years trying to articulate it in terms that his scientific peers would take seriously. He partnered with physicist Wolfgang Pauli on the subject, trying to bridge psychology and physics. What he proposed was that when a person's conscious attitudes align with their unconscious processes, when the ego and the self are moving in the same direction, external events begin to organize around that alignment in ways that feel acausal. The right person shows up, the opportunity appears, the book falls open to the page you needed, you think of someone and they call. He wasn't saying the universe is a vending machine. He was saying something much more interesting, that the boundary between inner and outer isn't as solid as we assume, that when you change something fundamental in your psychological structure, the change reverberates outward in ways that the rational mind can only categorize as coincidence. You've probably experienced this on a small scale, a period of your life when you felt genuinely aligned, where you weren't forcing anything, weren't performing, weren't strategizing every move, and things seemed to work. Doors opened, connections formed, opportunities materialized in ways you couldn't have planned. And then you probably lost it because the ego got involved and started trying to replicate the conditions instead of maintaining the inner state that created them. That inner state, the alignment between conscious and unconscious, between ego and self, is what Jung's entire framework is designed to cultivate. Everything else, all the techniques and concepts and theories, are in service of that one thing. Because Jung recognized that a person who has achieved that internal alignment doesn't need a 5-year plan. They need something much simpler and much harder. The willingness to trust what they know before they can prove it. This is where most people hit a wall, because trusting what you know before you can prove it feels, to the modern mind, like irresponsibility. We've been trained to value evidence, data, measurable outcomes, and that training serves us in 100 practical ways. But it fails us completely when it comes to the kind of knowing that Jung was talking about. He distinguished between 2 types of thinking: directed thinking, logical, sequential, goal-oriented, and what he called fantasy thinking, which operates through images, feelings, and associations. The modern world worships directed thinking and treats fantasy thinking as childish, useless, or dangerous. Go to any career counselor, any financial planner, any life coach, and you'll get directed thinking. Set goals, make plans, track metrics, be realistic. Jung argued that this one-sidedness is itself a psychological crisis, that a psyche deprived of its fantasy function, its ability to imagine, to play, to follow threads of meaning that don't submit to logic, becomes rigid, brittle, and eventually symptomatic. The anxiety, the depression, the sense of meaninglessness that so many high-functioning people carry around like a second skeleton. Jung would say these are often symptoms of a psyche that has been fed logic and starved of imagination. So when we say ignore reality, the Jungian translation is stop letting directed thinking monopolize your psyche. Give the other mode room to operate. Listen to the dream you had last week that made no sense. Follow the impulse that your rational mind calls stupid. Pay attention to the image that keeps appearing when you close your eyes. These aren't noise, they're signal. They're the unconscious trying to hand you information that your ego's filtering system keeps rejecting because it doesn't fit the current model. And here's the uncomfortable part. The unconscious doesn't care about your comfort. It doesn't care about your timeline. It doesn't care about your 5-year plan. It cares about wholeness. And wholeness sometimes requires demolishing what you've built so that something more real can take its place. This is why the process feels terrifying. You're being asked to let go of the map, the carefully constructed, socially validated map that tells you where you are and where you're going, and step into territory that only becomes visible once you're already walking through it. Think about someone who finally did this. Someone who, after years of overriding their own instincts, made a decision that every reasonable person in their life called a mistake. Maybe they left a stable job to pursue something that had no guaranteed outcome. Maybe they ended a relationship that looked perfect on paper because something inside them knew it was slowly killing them. Maybe they moved somewhere with no plan, said no to something everyone said they were crazy to turn down, or started something that had every statistical reason to fail. From the outside, this person looked reckless, irresponsible, maybe even selfish. The people who loved them worried. The people who didn't understand them judged. But 6 months later, or a year, or 3 years, some shift had occurred. The job they left led to a career that actually fit. The relationship that ended made room for one they didn't know was possible. The move put them in the exact environment where they could become who they'd been trying to become for decades in the wrong location. Was it smooth? Almost certainly not. Was it guaranteed? Absolutely not. Did it require a period of uncertainty that felt like walking off a cliff? Yes, every single time. Jung's work doesn't promise you outcomes. It promises something different: alignment. Alignment between who you are on the surface and who you are at the depth. And alignment, in Jung's framework, is what opens pathways that no amount of strategic planning can create, because strategic planning can only rearrange what already exists. Alignment creates conditions for something new. There's one more piece to this that's often overlooked, and it's the piece that separates Jung's framework from every manifestation trend that borrows his language without understanding his depth. Jung was very clear that engaging with the unconscious requires confronting your shadow. The shadow is everything about yourself that you've decided is unacceptable. Your rage, your selfishness, your hunger, your ambition that embarrasses you, your desires that don't match your self-image. It's the stuff you've pushed below the surface because showing it would threaten the persona you've built. And here's why this matters for anyone trying to get what they want. As long as the shadow is running the show from underground, what you think you want is contaminated by what you've repressed. The person chasing wealth might actually be chasing proof they're worthy. The person chasing love might actually be chasing the validation their parents withheld. The person chasing spiritual enlightenment might actually be running from their own humanity. Jung would say, you can't get what you truly want until you know who is doing the wanting. And you can't know who is doing the wanting until you've sat with your shadow long enough to see the difference between desires that arise from wholeness and desires that arise from compensation. This is the work that no shortcut can replace. Active imagination helps, dream journaling helps, therapy helps, honest self-reflection helps. But all of these are just doorways into the same room, the room where you meet the parts of yourself you've been avoiding, and discover that they hold the very energy you need to build the life that's actually yours. The person who integrates their shadow doesn't want less, they want more accurately. Their desire becomes precise. It stops scattering across 100 substitutes and focuses on the thing that will actually satisfy. And that precision, that psychological clarity, is what makes their actions effective in ways that look, to observers, almost effortless. Here's what I want you to take from this. Ignore reality is a provocation, and it's meant to be. But underneath the provocation is something Jung spent his entire career demonstrating. The reality you're responding to isn't the full picture. It's the picture your conscious mind has agreed to accept, filtered through wounds you didn't choose, beliefs you inherited, and a culture that mistakes productivity for meaning. The fuller picture exists in the parts of your psyche you haven't visited yet, in the dreams you forget by morning, in the impulses you override by afternoon, in the longing that surfaces at night when you're too tired to perform the version of yourself that keeps the machinery running. Jung would tell you that longing is information. It's the self trying to reach the ego across a gulf that most people spend their entire lives widening because they're afraid of what they'll find on the other side. Every time you dismiss an irrational desire as unrealistic, you widen that gulf. Every time you talk yourself out of something because it doesn't make logical sense, you teach your unconscious that you're not ready to hear it. Eventually, it stops trying. And that's when life goes gray in a way that no vacation, no promotion, no relationship can fix. But the opposite is also true. Every time you pause before dismissing the irrational impulse, every time you sit with the image instead of explaining it away, follow the thread instead of cutting it, you narrow the gap. You signal to your own deeper intelligence that you're willing to listen. And Jung found, across decades of work, that the unconscious responds to that willingness with a generosity that the rational mind simply cannot predict. You don't get everything you want instantly. You get something better. You get to want from the truest part of yourself. And when that part starts driving, the distance between wanting and having shrinks in ways that your old, realistic self would never have believed possible. If any of this has landed somewhere that feels familiar, if there's a pull in you that's been waiting for permission to take itself seriously, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this kind of turning point. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, designed to help you find your way within. The link is right below.